All right, let's dive into Prisoners of Geography by Tim Merrill. It's all about how, the physical world, like mountains and rivers and oceans, how they shape global politics, like even today. It's kind of wild when you think about it.
It really is. I mean, we often think in this digital age that geography doesn't matter as much anymore, but it really does. It kind of sets the stage,
Yeah.
for what nations can do, what they're afraid of, and what they want to achieve. Even in the 21st century, all this stuff is still relevant.
So the book isn't saying that geography is destiny, right? It's
Right.
like more complicated than that.
Yeah, exactly. Marshall argues that geography, it really constrains and influences what nations can do. It's not absolute, but it's a huge factor. For example, the Himalayas, they've pretty much prevented any big wars between China and India, even though they share this long border. And we've seen those little skirmishes, right?
Right, right. Totally different from places like the Middle East. Always conflict there, borders shifting all the time. What really got me in the book was that story Marshall tells about being with the U.S. military.
In Afghanistan. Right after 9/11,
Oh,
all that technology, right? And then the rain comes, turns everything to mud, and everything just
yeah.
stops.
Wow.
It just shows you, even today, you can't just ignore geography.
You really can't. And that brings us to Russia, actually. You know that article you shared? About Russia and NATO and how worried they are about NATO expanding. Well, a lot of that comes from geography. Russia's massive, right?
Yeah.
11 time zones.
Yeah.
But that size also makes them vulnerable, especially in the West.
Mm.
With the North European plain.
Oh, right. Yeah, there's nothing there. Is there no mountains, no big rivers to slow anyone down? It's just wide open.
Exactly. It's like an open door for invasions. And history shows us exactly that.
Makes sense.
Think about it. The Poles, the Swedes, Napoleon and his whole army, even Hitler, all marching across that plain. It's a pattern. And it's made Russia really insecure. So they always feel like they need, like a buffer zone to protect themselves.
Exactly.
So, Ukraine. That makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it, from Russia's point of view? Having a country right there, that's friendly with the West, right on that open plain. That's got to be terrifying for them.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a big reason why they took Crimea, that warm water port on the Black Sea. That was crucial for them, a strategic move, directly related to their geography.
So it's not just about defending themselves, right?
Yep.
They also use their geography offensively, like with energy.
Totally. Remember that report about Germany and how much they rely on Russian gas?
Oh, yeah.
Germany gets over 50% of its gas from Russia, and some countries, like Latvia, they're almost 100% dependent. Think about that.
Wow.
That gives Russia a ton of power, especially in the winter.
It's like they can control the weather, almost. Use it as a weapon.
In a way, yeah. And, Russia might dream of being a big naval power. But the Arctic Ocean, that's a problem for them. It has resources, sure, but it doesn't exactly make you a global superpower. So you've got these limitations from the Arctic, and then their landmass is just so huge. It makes them more of a land-based power.
It's making me think about China, actually, and how hard it is for them to become a real naval power.
Yeah.
Even though their economy is so strong, they've got a ton of coastline. But they're hemmed in, aren't they, by geography? It's something I never really considered before.
Right. And you had that article about the first island chain and how important it is strategically. It's like this chain of islands from Japan down to Taiwan, and it basically creates this bottleneck. It blocks China's access to the Pacific and
Yeah.
beyond.
So it's not just a bunch of random islands. It's like a chokehold on China's ambitions.
Pretty
No
sad.
wonder they're so focused on the South China Sea.
It makes perfect sense. It's not just about national pride. It's about securing those shipping lanes
Hmm.
and getting access to resources. They need to project power, but they're limited by this island chain. They know it.
So they're trying to get around it by building ports in the Indian Ocean
Mm.
and the Bay of Bengal. And they've got those plans for a land route through Pakistan, right? They're playing a long game.
They have to. Their geography forces them to be different, not like the United States, for example, the U.S. They've got this amazing position geographically, like they won the lottery or
Oh,
something
yeah.
like that.
Huge land mass, tons of resources. Those rivers like the Mississippi, perfect for trade inside the country,
Yeah.
and then oceans on both sides for protection. I mean, no wonder they became a superpower.
Right.
But even with all that, they can't just relax, can they?
No, not at all. Their geography, it let them grow into a continental power first. They secured themselves, the Louisiana Purchase, taking Texas, but projecting power globally, that's a whole other game. And it's getting even tougher with China rising.
Right. So even with all those advantages, they can't just sit back.
Yep.
This pivot to Asia we keep hearing about, that's them responding to China, right?
Exactly. They're having to adapt their strategy, focusing on those Pacific alliances.
Yeah.
to counter China's influence. And, their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, they've shown that even a superpower can't escape geography,
Right.
nation building in those kinds of places. Geographically complex, hostile. That's way different than just securing your own continent.
It's making me rethink everything I thought I knew about global politics. Like this idea that geography it's like this hidden code influencing everything.
So cool. Now I'm really curious about Europe. They've had their wars, obviously. But overall, their geography seems pretty good, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Europe has a lot going for it. Temperate climate, fertile land, those rivers, easy to navigate, lots of natural harbors. It all helped them industrialize early and dominate the world for centuries.
Please, yeah. It's like the perfect recipe for success. But Marshall also talks about the North-South divide in Europe, how those differences have caused tension. Right. The North, with all its industry, has historically been richer. The South, they've often struggled to keep up economically. You saw it in the Greek financial crisis. Those differences were amplified, almost broke the Eurozone apart.
It just shows you geography affects even something as complicated as a financial crisis.
Yeah.
It's not just about borders and resources. It's about the underlying economic structures, how they're influenced by location and climate. It's amazing. But how is Europe holding up as one entity? So many countries, so many cultures, all in one pretty small space. You'd think it would be chaos.
Well, the Franco-German relationship, that's really important for European unity in Germany, the most populous country and the most economically powerful. They have a really big role to play. But as you found in your research, there's all this anti-immigrant sentiment, and the demographics are shifting. That puts a lot of pressure on their unity.
Right. And then you've got Russia right there on their eastern border, always a reminder that they're vulnerable, even if they are unified. It's a tough balancing act. Speaking of tough, we can't forget the Middle East. It seems like geography and history have just collided there in this really explosive way.
You're right. Marshall makes this interesting point. The name Middle East, it's a European invention. And those borders, the ones drawn by colonial powers after World War I, they seem so random, right?
Yeah.
They didn't really care about the people who lived there, their ethnicities, their religions, and that's had a huge impact on the region. So much instability.
Yeah, it's like they just drew lines on a map.
Oh.
Without thinking about the people on the ground, like with Iraq.
Exactly. You mentioned that news report about the tension in Iraq between Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds. Well, the British basically forced 3 different groups into one country. Groups that historically were Assyria, Babylonia, and Sumer. They've got centuries of separate identities, power struggles, and now they're all crammed together.
No wonder Iraq has been so messed up. And then there's ISIS. They just wiped out the border between Iraq and Syria. They want to redraw the map.
Yeah.
Based on their ideology.
Yeah, it makes you realize how fragile those lines on a map really are, especially in a place as volatile as the Middle East.
Absolutely.
The rise of ISIS. How they've changed the region. It's a perfect example of how geography and ideology can intersect to reshape the political reality, the terrain, the refugees, access to oil. It all plays into their strategy.
It's fascinating and terrifying how they've used geography to their advantage. Speaking of borders, Marshall's chapter on India and Pakistan, that really stood out to me. That quote, India and Pakistan can agree on one thing. Neither wants the other one around. It's bleak, but also kind of funny.
Yeah.
In a dark way.
It really captures the relationship, doesn't it?
Yeah.
2 nuclear-armed rivals, born from a violent partition, sharing this long, contested border.
Take Kashmir, right in the middle. Just makes it worse.
Kashmir is the perfect example of how geography becomes the center of a conflict. For India, it's about controlling access to Central Asia and stopping Pakistan from bordering China. For Pakistan, it's about controlling the Indus River, where their water comes from, their lifeline.
So it's more than just land. It's about security, resources, national identity. And there's this constant risk of war, which neither country can really afford. It shows you geopolitics. It's rarely about simple solutions.
You got that right.
And then there's Africa. Marshall says it's been both shaped and hindered by its geography.
Yeah, Africa's size, all those different landscapes, deserts, rainforests, mountains, it's made it hard to develop unified political structures, strong economies. And that article you shared about the Democratic Republic of Congo, it shows how those borders, drawn by European colonial powers, they just ignored existing tribal and ethnic boundaries, and that's created a legacy of conflict that continues to this day.
It's so sad to think about how lines on a map have led to so much suffering.
The DRC is a tragic example of how geography, resources, and colonial history can all come together to create this perfect storm of instability. It's incredibly rich in minerals, like coltan, which we use in our smartphones, and other electronics, that wealth, combined with weak state structures and porous borders, it's made it a battleground for all these armed groups, all fighting for control.
It's a reminder that what happens in these far-off places can really affect us directly, even if we don't realize it. We're all connected. And geography plays a huge role in how those connections play out.
It's true. And then you've got Latin America, a region that often feels overshadowed by its powerful neighbor to the north.
Right. It's like they're living in the shadow of a giant.
Yeah, and their geography hasn't made things easy. The lack of natural harbors, those huge Andes mountains, the Amazon rainforests, so vast and difficult to navigate, it's all limited their economic development and prevented the kind of political unity we see in Europe or North America.
It's like they're constantly fighting an uphill battle, literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And then there's the legacy of colonialism. All that wealth and power, concentrated in the hands of a few. It's created this cycle of inequality and instability. That's really hard to break.
And Marshall talks about Mexico, right, as a case study.
Yeah.
It shows how geography and history can create these problems that seem impossible to solve.
Mexico's proximity to the U.S., it's given them both opportunities and challenges. The drug trade, for example, it's a direct consequence of being next to the world's largest drug market. The cartels, they've exploited weaknesses in the Mexican state, taken advantage of that porous border, and created this multi-billion-dollar industry that fuels violence and corruption.
It's tragic. And you can see how geography has shaped it. But it's not just about Mexico, is it?
Yeah.
It seems like China is really trying to increase their influence in Latin America,
Right.
challenging the U.S.
You're right. China's investing heavily in infrastructure projects. They're securing access to resources, building new trade partnerships all throughout Latin America. It's a strategic move to diversify the reach and create an alternative to U.S. influence. That Nicaragua canal you mentioned in your research.
Oh, yeah. That's a perfect example.
A Chinese-backed canal to rival the Panama Canal. That's a bold move.
It is.
It shows they're playing the long game.
They are.
It's fascinating. We've talked a lot about specific regions, but I want to go back to something central to the book, natural resources and how they shape geopolitics. We talked about Russia and their oil and gas, but what are some other examples of how resources are influencing global power? Well, look at the Middle East. It's sitting on some of the world's largest oil reserves. That's made it a strategic prize for global powers for decades. Control of those resources, it's fueled conflicts, driven alliances, shaped the entire political landscape of the region. And those recent problems with oil prices, the ones you mentioned in your research, they highlight how much global markets and political stability are tied to the geography of oil production.
It's amazing how something like oil can have such a huge impact.
It shows you that geography isn't just about mountains and rivers. It's also about the resources those landscapes contain and how those resources shape human behavior and interactions.
It's like resources become part of the geography, part of the strategic map that countries are always navigating. We've been talking about how geography still matters in the 21st century, but technology is changing so fast. Is it starting to override those old geographical constraints?
That's the big question, isn't it? Technology is definitely blurring some of those traditional lines. But technology is a tool. It can be used to overcome geographical barriers or to exploit them. It can connect people or divide them. The impact of technology on geopolitics, it's not a simple thing.
So it's not just about technology making geography irrelevant. It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's creating new opportunities and new challenges. And we have to figure out how to navigate this new landscape.
Do you have any examples of how technology is actually impacting geopolitics in concrete ways?
Well, one obvious one is cyber warfare. The internet has created this new battle space, one that goes beyond physical borders. Countries are investing heavily in their cyber capabilities, both offensive and defensive. And it's changing warfare in really profound ways.
Wow, it's like a whole new dimension of conflict, where geography matters less and digital skills matter more.
That's one way to look at it.
But I also imagine there are ways where technology is actually reinforcing the importance of geography, even as it's blurring some of the old lines.
You're right. Look at the Arctic. Climate change is melting the ice caps, opening up new shipping routes, access to resources. But those opportunities are also creating competition. Countries are fighting for position in the Arctic, building up their icebreaker fleets, asserting their territorial claims.
So technology is making the Arctic more accessible, but also more contested, more strategically important. It's like a new gold rush. And geography is still the map.
I like that analogy. And it's not just the Arctic. Look at deep-sea drilling. Technology is making it possible to extract oil and gas from places that were inaccessible before. new frontiers for resource extraction, and potential new flashpoints for conflict, like the South China Sea.
It's like this constant push and pull. Technology changes the game,
Yeah,
but geography is still the playing field.
I like that.
And as technology keeps advancing, it's going to be even more important to understand geography
Definitely.
and how it influences our world
Yeah.
and how we interact with each other.
That brings us back to one of Marshall's main ideas. Geography isn't destiny, but it's a powerful force. It shapes our choices and ultimately our destinies.
It's humbling, isn't it? We like to think we're in control, masters of our own fate, but we're all, to some extent, prisoners of geography.
We are.
But that doesn't mean we're powerless, right?
Right.
It just means we need to understand the constraints and the opportunities that geography presents and use that knowledge to make good decisions.
Exactly. And that's why books like Prisoners of Geography are so important. They help us see the world differently, to appreciate how connected geography and history are, to understand the forces that shape our lives and our future. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring how geography shapes nations and global politics. But there's still more to unpack.
My mind is blown. I'm seeing the world in a whole new way. But we're not done yet, right?
Not quite. We'll be back after a short break to explore some final thoughts and key takeaways from Prisoners of Geography. And I'll leave you with some questions to think about as you continue your own exploration of this fascinating subject. Before the break, we were talking about how technology, it's both changing and reinforcing the importance of geography. It's wild how something like cyberspace, which seems so abstract, can actually intersect with the physical world, landscapes, resources, all that.
It really is. It's like you mentioned deep sea drilling, right?
Yeah.
Opening up these new places to get resources. So does that mean we're going to see more fights over underwater territory?
It's definitely a possibility. As technology lets us reach those harder to get resources, those areas become, well, more important strategically. We already see it, right, in the South China Sea. All these countries claiming the same underwater oil and gas.
Oh, wow. So it's like the scramble for colonies. But underwater this time.
Kind of, yeah. And the Arctic, too. Another example. Resources driving competition.
Yeah.
The ice melts.
Yeah.
Those places that were unreachable before, they become more attractive. Not just for resources, but also for shipping routes.
Right. Those new shipping lanes opening up. How's that changing things for countries like Russia and the U.S.?
Well, for Russia, the Arctic is basically their backyard, right? Long coastline. They see it as super important strategically. The melting ice means they could have this northern sea route, a shipping lane that cuts travel time between Europe and Asia. Huge economic impact. Could change global trade, potentially.
So Russia's in a good spot to take advantage.
Yeah.
But the U.S., they don't have much Arctic coastline, do they?
That's true. Just a little bit in Alaska. But they're still paying attention. They see the Arctic as a potential security issue, especially with Russia getting more assertive. So the U.S. is increasing their military presence up there. People are even talking about a new Cold War playing out in the Arctic.
It's a different kind of Cold War than the last one, though, right? Back then, it was all about ideology and the threat of nuclear war. This new one, it seems more about resources and strategic access.
Yeah, good point. The stakes are still high. But the competition is different. It's more about economic influence and strategic positioning.
It all goes back to the idea that geography isn't static. It's always changing.
Yeah.
And those changes are having a huge impact on how countries interact.
Absolutely. And it's not just about political and military stuff either, these changing landscapes. They also affect the environment and people's lives. Climate change, for example, it's forcing people to move from areas that are becoming unlivable, rising sea levels, desertification.
We see it in the news all the time now.
Yeah.
Climate refugees leaving their homes or trying to survive in these drought-stricken areas. It's heartbreaking. It shows you that geography, it's not just some abstract concept.
Yeah.
It's the stage where all this human drama is playing out.
And those human stories, they often get lost in all the big talk about geopolitics. But we have to remember, these global shifts, they're affecting real people in very real ways.
I think that's one of the big takeaways from the book. Geography isn't just about maps and borders. It's about understanding how those landscapes affect people.
Absolutely.
How they shape our lives, our cultures, even our conflicts.
And that understanding is crucial. If we're going to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, we can't just look at maps and analyze military strategies. We need to consider the human element, how these geographical realities intersect with people's hopes and fears, their dreams.
It makes you think about all the places we've talked about. Russia, worried about their western border. China with their ambitions in the ocean, Europe trying to stay unified, the Middle East dealing with the legacy of colonialism, Africa struggling with development and conflict, Latin America trying to find their own way. Behind all that, geopolitics are real people, real communities, trying to make sense of a world that's changing so fast.
Exactly, and their stories are tied to the geography of their regions. Understanding those connections, that's essential if we want to find real solutions to these complex problems.
It's a lot to process,
Yeah.
but it's so important. I feel like I'm seeing the world with new eyes, appreciating the complexity, how everything is connected.
That's what's so fascinating about geopolitics. It's a way to look at not just the physical world, but also the human condition. It's about understanding the forces that shape our destinies and the choices we make within those constraints.
We've covered so much,
Yeah.
but as we get to the end of our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, one of the most important, I think, is that geography isn't destiny, but it's a powerful force. We need to understand it and deal with it. It shapes how we see the world, what we think is possible, even our conflicts.
Right. It's like this code running in the background, affecting everything,
Yeah.
from economics to military strategy to culture.
Another crucial point is that geography isn't static. It's always evolving through natural processes like climate change, or human interventions like technology, or political decisions.
So we can't just look at a map and think that's how it's always going to be.
Nope.
We need to pay attention to how those landscapes are changing and how those changes affect the balance of power.
Exactly. And one final takeaway, building on what you just said, we are all interconnected. What happens in one part of the world affects other parts, even if we don't see it right away. We need to move beyond a narrow nationalistic view and embrace a more global perspective.
That's a powerful message, a call for understanding, empathy, and cooperation. In a world that often feels so divided.
I think it's the only way forward. We're all in this together, sharing the same planet, facing the same challenges. We need to work together to find solutions. And that starts with understanding geography, the realities that connect us all.
Well said. This deep dive has been an incredible journey. I've learned so much about the world and our place in it, but I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear your final thoughts, that one last provocative idea, to leave them thinking.
Okay, here's something to consider. Imagine if we looked at geopolitics, not as a game where someone wins and someone loses, but as a collaboration to solve our shared problems. What if we used our geographical advantages to create a more sustainable world, a more equitable world, a more peaceful world for everyone? That's the challenge I leave you with.
Wow, that's a powerful challenge, and one that's worth thinking about deeply. It reminds us that we have a choice in how we respond to geography. We can compete, or we can collaborate. The future is up to us.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, let's remember the wisdom of Tim Marshall's book, Understanding Geography. It's not just about gaining knowledge, it's about using that knowledge to make better decisions, to build bridges instead of walls, to create a more just and sustainable world for future generations.
Beautifully said. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration of Prisoners of Geography. I hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as I have. Until next time, stay curious.
That challenge, to see geopolitics as working together,
Yeah.
it's really stuck with me. It's so easy to just focus on the competition.
It is, yeah. It's human nature, I think, to worry about those things, especially when we feel threatened.
Right.
But as we've seen, those winner-takes-all approaches, they often lead to more conflict, more instability.
And those conflicts, they're getting more complex, aren't they? It's not just countries fighting each other anymore.
Exactly.
We've got these new kinds of conflict, like cyber warfare. And it's hard to tell who's a state actor and who isn't.
You're right. The battle space is changing. The old rules, they don't apply anymore. Think about it. A cyber attack can cripple a whole country, mess up their economy, cause chaos, all without firing a single bullet.
And it could come from anywhere.
Exactly.
It makes it tough to figure out who to blame and how to respond.
It's a whole new dimension of warfare, happening alongside all the usual stuff, resources, territory, power. It's a lot to process.
It is, but I think the key is, even with all this complexity, we still have choices. We can choose how we react, how we engage with all this.
So it's not about giving up.
No, not at all.
Or feeling like we can't do anything.
It's about recognizing the challenges, understanding what's going on, and then making smart decisions about how to move forward.
And that's where knowledge is power, right?
Exactly.
That's why we're doing this deep dive.
Right.
To give people the tools they need to understand these things and to have these conversations,
About empowering people.
to be informed citizens,
Yes.
to think critically about all the information thrown at us, and to make choices that reflect our values and our hopes for the future.
I like that. And when we think about those choices, we have to talk about climate change. We've mentioned it throughout this deep dive. But it's worth stressing just how much climate change is changing everything.
It's not just about the ice caps melting or the sea level rising.
Yeah.
It's about food, water, people being forced to move, political instability. It affects everything, and it makes those existing tensions even worse.
It's like a threat multiplier,
Yeah.
making everything more dangerous, more volatile. Think about the Sahel region in Africa. Climate change is turning it into desert. So the herders and farmers, they're fighting over what little resources are left. Those conflicts, they can spread across borders, destabilize whole regions. And we're seeing the same thing in other parts of the world, the Middle East, South Asia, Latin America.
So climate change is like, it's making those existing tensions worse and creating new ones.
It is, and it's forcing us to rethink how we approach security and development. We can't just focus on military solutions or economic growth. We have to deal with the root causes: environmental degradation, lack of resources, social inequality.
So we need a more holistic approach, one that recognizes how everything is connected.
Exactly.
And we need solutions that address those root causes.
I think that's key.
And we have to understand, climate change isn't just an environmental issue.
Right.
It's a security issue, an economic issue, a social justice issue. It's a human issue.
It is.
This deep dive, it's really opened my eyes to the scale of the challenges. But I'm also feeling this urgency. Like, we need to act now.
I agree.
Make those tough choices.
Yeah.
And start building a better future.
I feel that urgency too. The window of opportunity, it's closing. But I'm also hopeful. We have the knowledge, the technology, the resources. We need the political will and the determination to act.
And that's where we come in, right? As informed citizens,
Yeah,
we have to engage, hold our leaders accountable, demand action.
We can't just sit back and wait. We all have a part to play.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've explored the world through the lens of geography, uncovering these connections between landscapes, resources, and human lives.
We've seen how mountains can divide, how rivers can unite. We've looked at the challenges of landlocked countries and the opportunities for coastal states. We've witnessed empires rise and fall, the shifts in power, all shaped by our planet.
It's been fascinating. A reminder that while geography might not be destiny, it's a force we have to understand
It is.
as we move forward. Let's take these insights with us.
Yes.
The connections we've made,
Yeah.
the urgency we feel. Let's use all of this to navigate the challenges ahead and to create a world that's more just, more sustainable, more peaceful for everyone.
That's a great vision.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Prisoners of Geography. I hope you found it enlightening, thought-provoking, and empowering. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those maps handy.